You can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific. And how?
Obscura is an appropriate title for this episode as it's kinda all over the place. The Kryptofreak plot is very much in the background and buried under a lot of loose ends being tied up and new developments established for the season finale. There's really no major theme or through line to the narrative, but rather a lot of items marked off a checklist. So to make it feel like it's trying new things with the regular formula again, it makes the Kryptofreak Lana. In the teaser, she gets caught in a gas explosion, which somehow gives her the involuntary ability to see through somebody's eyes. Conveniently, that somebody just happens to be the real bad guy, and the guy who just happens to have kidnapped Chloe. And Lana gets visions of images seen from his eyes to give her just the clues she and Clark need to piece together where Chloe's being held. I should mention that before she's kidnapped, Chloe was apparently staying with her cousin in Metropolis, so this is technically the first mention of Lois Lane in the series, without, of course, the audience realizing yet that that's who it is. Unless, of course, she has some other cousin in Metropolis we're not told about. Anyway, while Chloe's missing and nobody's really sure if something bad actually happened to her or not, a number of other little subplots are happening. Lex finally gets the estimate of damages done to the Kent farm by fake Jude back in Zero and tries to pay Jonathan back for it, since it's technically Luthor Corp's fault. But Jonathan is still stubborn about taking anything from the Luthors and waffles on whether or not he should cash the check. This time he finally decides to put his pride aside and be reasonable. Lex isn't giving him a handout, he actually owes him the money. But when he finds out Lex is testing the land where Clark's ship crashed down, claiming to just be doing a routine check because Luthor Corp is thinking of buying the land, Jonathan fears he's getting close to Clark's secret and freaks out, giving Lex his check back. It turns out that a crop duster actually saw Clark's ship crash and tells Lex about it. Everybody thinks the guy's crazy, and Lex pretends to also, but then he checks it out anyway, and sure enough, Dr. Hamilton finds a strange metal octagonal disc in the field. And Jonathan's impulsive response was a bad move, because it reaffirms Lex's suspicions that the Kents are deeply involved with this mystery, even after seeing that Clark didn't seem to have any powers back in the Leech, and after telling Roger Nixon that the Kents are off limits. And speaking of good old Roger Nixon, he's back and figuring more out about what's going on in Smallville than anyone. He's the one who turned Lex onto the crop duster, and it turns out he's also been spying on Clark, and we find toward the end that he's watching as Clark makes yet another miraculous save. There's also Lana trying to find a good moment to break it off with Whitney, and Whitney thinking of changing his career path after he finds his dad's old war medals now that he's passed away, and more love triangle stuff with Clark, Chloe, and Lana, of course. Clark finally asks Chloe to the spring formal. Yay. By the end of the episode, we find that a deputy actually kidnapped Chloe to then turn around and rescue her to make a name for himself. When Lana finds him, he tries to kill her because she's seen too much, but of course, Clark happens to catch up to her, x-ray the whole creepy deserted carnival, see her just before she gets shot, and stop the bullet and a bunch of falling glass in bullet time, just in the nick of time. The bad cop gets gunned down by police, and Lana sees his death through his own eyes, which doesn't traumatize her even a little bit. In the final scene, we find out that the crop duster has, quote, disappeared, and then Hamilton reveals to Lex that the octagonal disc is of an alloy unlike anything on Earth, and a scene transition reveals to the audience that the disc fits in Clark's ship. Then credits. I'm really glad to see Lex back on Clark's trail and so close to the truth he can smell it, but still realistically not being able to put all the pieces together. Lana and Chloe and Lex constantly being knocked unconscious as a plot convenience so they don't see Clark use his powers is always lame, but so far this continual plot thread where Lex just doesn't quite have enough to put this mystery together makes a lot of sense. I love the scene with the crop duster, where Lex acts like he's wasting his time, telling Nixon he'll give the guy 5 minutes, gives him $600 for his story, looks completely dissatisfied with his answer, and then later goes to the place the guy claims he saw a spaceship and makes guys in hazmat suits scour all over it. That's the kind of posturing and strategizing that makes Lex seem really smart and capable. Makes him fun to watch, but also makes the audience a little sad watching him, because every time he does something like this, he's getting closer and closer to comic book supervillain Lex. He and Clark are in such a tough place right now. He knows Clark's not telling him everything that he and his father knows, because clearly there has to be a reason Jonathan was suddenly so angry to see him in that field. And Clark doesn't want to deceive his friend, but he really has no choice. This episode does a fantastic job of illustrating the idea that Lex's innate curiosity will soon start unraveling the friendship built all season. and it's taking its time getting there in a pretty believable way. In the loft, Clark asks Lex why he can't just put the past behind him. And Lex has a great line where he talks about how we still see the stars long after they've actually burned out. He says, "The past is always influencing the present. I can't change that. All I can do is try to understand it." That argument is extremely human and extremely compelling, and all Clark does whenever he tries to convince Lex to give up on this quest for the truth is make it more obvious that he has a secret, personal reason to want Lex to stop. So all he can do is sit there and say nothing. Good stuff. I'm glad to see Raj or Nixon again. It's been a lot of episodes, and it's nice to see this kind of continuity creeping back in after a lot of mostly standalone episodes. Lex put Nixon in a really tough place earlier in the season, and we find here that their chess match isn't over. They're both posturing here, but it turns out Nixon holds the trump card. It's a great reveal when we find out he's watching Clark, and this little tabloid reporter I might have figured was just a throwaway character to show Lex having to deal with the media is actually a pretty sizable threat to both Lex and Clark. Smallville tries plot twists and surprises that are often either too telegraphed, too obvious, or too unbelievable, but this one is genuinely a good surprise. Clark is back to being more level-headed and mature in this episode. I guess it just depends on what the script needs. Last episode I complained because Clark was moping about not taking advantage of a rift between Lana and Whitney when he had the chance, when that rift was related to Whitney's father getting sick, and it was actually a really grown-up decision. Now, here, we've got Clark uncharacteristically seeing the bigger picture and actually catching on to something that's really happening. When he tells his father he should cash Lex's check, he says slamming the door in his face over and over again only helps get him closer to what you think he already is. And then Jonathan says, "When did you get so wise?" Yeah, that's my question too. What happened between last episode and this one that suddenly got you thinking about anyone but yourself, Clark, when you just got through moping around at a funeral because you were too busy trying to decide if you were more interested in Lana or Chloe? Clark responds with, "Ask my dad." Okay, that's a good line, and I generally buy that Jonathan is a great father with a good moral center, and even in this episode, when he makes mistakes, like the one he makes with Lex, it doesn't feel inconsistent, he just feels human, because he clearly realizes that he let his temper get the better of him again. It's too bad Clark isn't thinking about what his father might do when he's dealing with his love life. I would have bought all this business about Clark growing up a lot through this season if he hadn't been forced to take steps backwards by easy drama. I'm not knocking this episode for mistakes previous episodes made, but since this one is mostly building on pre-established story, consistency is really important, and so some of those inconsistencies make it harder to appreciate these moments when I'm actually liking Clark again. I also want to briefly mention how cool a shot I think Lex staring down at and contemplating the octagonal key is at the end. And then it focuses on the key to reveal the Kryptonian lettering, which we haven't seen yet. Really great camera work, and a definite whoa moment the first time I saw it. Laziest bad guy ever. When we finally get past the really obvious red herring, the cop who doesn't believe in Lana's visions and later shows up and acts really creepy, only to turn out not to be the bad guy, we find out that the mass psycho who kidnapped Chloe is, of course, the level-headed cop who listens to everything Lana has to say. Kind of funny, by the way, when you pair cops together like this, there's always got to be a Mulder and a Scully. This, by the way, is one of those unsuccessful attempts at an effective plot twist I mentioned earlier. But worse than that is his motivations, given in a single line and not expanded on at all. Literally, this deputy just says that he could have been the best cop ever. That's why he kidnapped Chloe with plans to pretend to rescue her. What does that mean? So what's the deal? Did he screw up a bunch of times at his job and nobody will give him a chance at anything now? Did he get demoted or something? I mean, why is he so angry? Why is he resorting to crazy criminal activities and wearing a Bane mask and hanging out in carnivals? Well, okay, obviously the real answer to that is that this episode's going for some creepy atmosphere, and it doesn't care if the story actually lives up to that atmosphere. We've had some goofy villain motivations before, but this one really takes the cake. We can't even give this guy that bogus excuse of meteor-induced superpowers make you crazy that gets used in a lot of later seasons because he's not even a Kryptofreak. This kind of thing really doesn't happen very often, so it comes off as hilariously ridiculous. I guess we could stretch for an answer and say that if people were getting murdered all the time in a small town, and for the sake of argument, we'll once again pretend like this is a small town, if there was that much precedent set, then maybe regular, non-superpowered people would start thinking of crime as more of an option to solve their problems. Like, somehow it seems more okay because everybody's doing it. But of course, if there was really a town like this where somebody got murdered every every week, and usually they were high school kids, everyone would move away. It's great that we're not even past the first season and Chloe can be bound and blindfolded, say, "Come on, Chloe, you've been through worse than this," and that statement is actually accurate. Keep in mind that she's a 9th grader. Kind of funny to me, too, that we see the population sign again in this episode. People get killed or almost killed all the time here. I still don't know how you doubled your population in 11 years. Expect to hear me complain about this next thing a lot from here on out, because last episode started something that's going to be a main staple from here until the end of the series. Love triangles take precedence over everything. You can be lying in a hospital bed after being kidnapped and having this terrible ordeal and scared out of your mind that the guy who tied you up and blindfolded you might find you and kill you at any moment, but let me tell you, if you're in love with the guy Lana Lang's in love with, you're getting stared at through a window with love triangle face. Seriously, Lana? You're that selfish and taking it that personally because Chloe asked Clark to stay with her so she'll feel safer after being freaking kidnapped? It bothers you that much that they're holding hands after all of that? Okay, here's the thing. I realize that high school kids can be that irrational. I realize these people aren't grown-ups yet. They've got a ways to go before anyone can expect them to show a lot of real maturity. What bothers me about scenes like this is that the audience seems to be expected to feel sorry for Lana. Like this is a dramatic moment centering around a romance we're supposed to care about despite all the almost death. Just like the funeral, there's a time and a place, and this ain't it. If Lana or anyone else is going to act like this, it can't be portrayed as okay behavior like I think it is here. I can be made to find it believable, but I need these characters to grow in the process. I don't like being asked to lower myself to the standards of shallow people, and that's my biggest beef with this show. Every other episode or more, there's at least one scene that does exactly that. Once again, somebody makes a pop culture reference that couldn't exist without Superman. Chloe says, "Clark Kent leaps tall theories in a single bound." Why does no one question stuff like that? No one would just say something like that. It comes off, even in the context of the scene, as a pop culture reference. Cute doesn't always equal clever, and lines like this that just take you out and make you question how a character could possibly even come up with it are not clever. Now this is a minor nitpick, but when Jonathan asked Clark how long he was at the hospital with Chloe, he says he was there all night and that he snuck in after visiting hours. Jonathan just responds with, "I'm sure Chloe appreciated that." Wow, he's got to be the coolest dad ever. He's okay with his son just breaking rules like that because he has superpowers? Other people have sick friends in hospitals and they don't get to sneak in after visiting hours. Heck, this is Smallville. There are probably other people at that hospital visiting other people who just got kidnapped too. What kind of example is Jonathan setting for his son by not calling him on breaking rules like that? And finally, what's with bad guys burying people alive in this show? How often do people really pick that method to murder someone? I've got no questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven this week, so let's just go straight on to the scoreboard. We've got one Kryptofreak, that's Lana. We've got a brand new category, main character Kryptofreaks, and that one this week, of course, is Lana. I'm going to be counting times a character becomes a Kryptofreak and not just each one of them that does, because it happens to most of them, and most of them more than once. I'm on the fence about whether or not to count Lex as a Kryptofreak, but we'll discuss that in later episodes. We've got one instance of Clark and Lana in the loft. We've got two instances of convenient unconsciousness this week, and both are in two entirely different scenes. We've got one where Clark rips Chloe out of the ground when she's buried alive, and then we've got one when Clark is rescuing Lana in bullet time. We've got one instance of somebody walking away from somebody else angry. That's when Jonathan gives Lex his check back. We've got one instance of a Kryptonian artifact. That's, of course, the octagonal key. We've got one instance of bullet time when Clark stops a bullet and saves Lana from falling glass. And we've got one instance of a bad guy dying in a fight with Clark. Okay, it's actually after a fight with Clark, but close enough. I'll count it anyway. And finally, we've got one S or shield, and that's the ship. This is the first time we get a good look at the new redesign of the ship, which is on its side, but you can still kind of tell, even from this angle, that it's supposed to be in the shape of the Superman shield. Despite all the criticisms, I'm going to give Obscura a 2.5 out of 4. It's not the most focused episode, and the villain is the weakest we've seen so far, but that plot seems tacked on simply because, once again, this show seems to think it must have a homicidal threat or it's not exciting enough. The continuation of Lex, Clark, and Jonathan's interaction with each other is quite good, and there's a lot of intriguing setup going into the season finale. Is there anything I missed in any category? Send me a personal message on Geekvolution, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode Count it.